always excited about the podcast. This is one of my favorite things to do during the week, and uh, I I like it every time, except when I don't.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and on today's show, we're talking about Genesis chapters 24, 25, and 26. And with me, as always, we've got Greg and we've got Eric. Greg, what's up with you today?
Oh, wow. Not a whole lot. It's a good day. The
What
Lord
was
is
the,
good.
oh, wow.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think.
Oh,
Yeah, no.
were you surprised by the question? I pretty much ask you every time.
Yeah, maybe the way you phrased it. No. Yeah, God is good. Everything's well, blessedly boring as usual. And so we're trucking along.
Amen. No, I do try and vary the way that I ask it. It's the same general question, but I think I get you tripped up. I think the one you tripped up the most on was when I said, "What up, my dudes?" or something like that.
GM Kings.
I don't even know what that means. So
Oh, wow. Yeah. You're good.
let's
How
go
to
ahead and
live.
move on. Eric, how about you? Hopefully you're not surprised. How are you doing today?
I'm, as usual, doing fairly well. Always excited about the podcast. This is one of my favorite things to do during the week, and I like it every time, except when I don't. So
That's very specific and well said. So, I enjoy talking with you guys as well. And so up on the slate for today, as we said, is Genesis 24, 25, and 26. So unless there's any more like, hey, you were right or anything like that, we can dive right into it. Anybody want to?
Eric, you want to volunteer?
Any more stuff?
this time, no. I'm not really aware of anything at the moment, but
Okay.
but if something comes up, Greg, I will make sure to give you the credit.
That's good. Well, that's what Greg's here for, is for the credit. So let's dive into Genesis chapter
Here
20.
for all the glory, guys. Yeah.
So Genesis chapter 24 is a passage that is somewhat strange, I think, to some readers. You know, we see this interaction of finding a wife for Isaac. Walk us through your understanding of this passage, why this is recorded, anything that we can glean from this, and if you were talking with somebody maybe who's reading this, going, this is kind of weird. Any clarification you could bring on this, or thoughts that you have from Genesis 24?
Yeah, I guess I would say we always need to be careful of not making descriptive narrative prescriptive. This isn't instructions for how you should necessarily go about finding a son for finding a wife for your son. But this is, I think, another image of God providing, God opening doors that, making way where it seems that there wouldn't naturally be a way. So what we see here is the providence of God steering events, providing for Abraham and for Isaac, just as he said he would. So.
Yeah, well said. As 21st century Americans, I think we have a tendency to judge all cultures of the past based on 21st century American standards. That's become really popular right now, and I think it's just.
I do.
Silly.
I just judge them as better than us. So.
Yeah. You could. There's ways of judging that are acceptable. But I think it's foolish to think that every society in history should have thought and behaved just like we do today. So this idea of, finding a wife for your son, while we can't relate to that, this was pretty common back then. And unfortunately, people today seem to think like, modern day standards or modern day culture is like the standard by which we judge all of history and all other cultures and nations. I just think that's very, very naive. Now in Genesis 24, Abraham sends his servant to find Isaac a wife from among his relatives. So Isaac wasn't responsible for finding himself a wife. Abraham assumed that responsibility.
At 40 years old, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. So, which is interesting because that's quite a while to wait. But the details of the story, though, make it clear that this was not intended to be a forced marriage. And we know that. There's actually two passages that make this pretty clear. And in Genesis 24, verse 5, notice it says that the servant said to him, "Suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came?" So it's like he has in mind, well, maybe she won't consent to this. Maybe she's not willing to, to do what I'm wanting her to do. And then later on in the same chapter, in verses 57 and 58, this is Rebekah's family. It says, and they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. Then they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. So it seems like this is not a forced marriage. They're considering Rebekah's wishes in the situation, and but Rebekah does consent. She does agree to it, and she goes and becomes the wife of Isaac. So, and the servant seemed to believe this turn of events was from God. It was not just an incredible stroke of luck. So God really gets the glory in this situation, in this story.
It's funny, as a parent of, how many kids do I have now, Joe? Help me out. 7 kids. The desire to go back to arranged marriages doesn't seem that odd to me anymore. Now, I have one son-in-law now, and I'm soon to have. I have one pending, one in the batter's box. And I'm very, very happy with the men that my 2 oldest daughters have chosen. But I got to tell you, I would be very happy if our culture suddenly changed its mind and arranged, marriages arranged by the parents became the norm. I'd be all for that.
So God gets the glory in this, Eric, you said. What is the point of this being in the narrative? Why have such a long chapter about this? We haven't necessarily seen, like when we saw Cain go, he just takes his wife, and you're like, oh, he has a wife, and off he goes, and or whatever. It's kind of not a big deal. Why is this becoming a bigger deal? Is there any purpose or insight that we can get into why we get a whole chapter about this?
Well, I think originally Abraham said he actually made his servant swear that he would not choose a wife for Isaac from among the Canaanites. He wanted a wife from his own family, and because of Canaanite culture, because of just how different they were, and different is a very kind word to use. But I think it just shows that Abraham has in mind still the promises that God have made to him and his descendants, and he's operating in a way where he's taking all that into consideration in the choices that he's making.
Yeah, I guess I would echo that. And also, again, wanting to keep the original audience in mind. This would be setting up for the Israelites. No, look, you are separate. We don't mix that line with our line. And even within the chapters we're going to discuss, we're going to see somebody who doesn't maintain that. And it's a problem for them. So it's at least my understanding that the depth of the story here is proof to the original audience, first of all, that God is directing this, but also that these proper distinctions are being maintained.
Let's jump into the next chapter then. And so in Genesis chapter 25, it kind of starts off with something that almost seems the opposite of this. We get a description of Abraham taking another wife by the name of Keturah. I remember when I was in seminary, I had various exegetical assignments, and I was once assigned to look at this passage, and I spent a lot of time in the theological library looking up journal articles and all this scholarly stuff to see what people said about this passage. And I was amazed at how little is actually discussed about this passage. Is this a passage you guys have studied in any great depth? Or, I know you've read it many times, but do you have any insight? Why is this recorded now in Scripture?
Are you asking beyond the original context, again, of helping the Israelites understand their place in relation to all of these people that are surrounding them? Or are you looking for something? I guess that's my answer. If there's some more answer, I could tell you no, that I haven't spent a whole lot of time trying to dig into the deep philosophical, theological significance of this.
I'm not trying to lead you anywhere. I'm trying to, it's open-ended. So as you understand it, I'm interested in your answer. So can you elaborate a little bit on what you're saying?
Sure. Well, if for no other reason, as Moses is leading out the people, we see an on-again, off-again relationship with the people of Midian, right? Well, who is Midian, and why are they closely connected? And Well, here they would be cousins, right? So again, explaining why these aren't the chosen people, but why there is relation there, and yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
That's fair. Eric, what about you? What insights do you have on this? Somewhat, like I say, it's not a passage that I hear a lot of sermons about. You don't see a lot of Christian best-selling books about this aspect. And I personally was surprised at the lack of commentary even on this. So, what thoughts do you have about Abraham's marriage to Keturah?
I don't have any profound thoughts, I guess, but I will say that we need to make a distinction about distinctions, because it wasn't so much. I think the issue was not so much about how should I say, mixing races. It was more so about keeping, I think, religions distinct. So, for example, I don't know that the problem was so much that God just wanted these one racial people, and he didn't want races being mixed. It was more so he didn't want cultures and religions being mixed.
Yeah, I can answer that for sure. Yeah.
So it was. I don't want to jump ahead. There's a lot to say about this later on in Scripture, so we'll stop right there. But Abraham marrying Keturah, I don't see that as a problem if Keturah had been a worshiper of his God, the one true God. Now, if she was worshiping a false god, now that would have been an issue, because now you have a mixed marriage in a religious sense, and that's a very serious problem and a stumbling block. But her simply being, of a different race, that was not an issue at all. Now, I do want to say something about everything that happens here, because in verses 1-6 of Genesis 25, it sounds like the passage sets Isaac apart from the rest of Abraham's children. It shows that God had a special purpose for Isaac and his descendants. And while Isaac remained in Canaan, Abraham sent his other sons to the land of the east, it says, implying that in a sense, Canaan belonged to Isaac and his descendants. So it wasn't so much like, well, you guys, are no good, and you guys need to be, you guys are cursed or something. It was just simply that God made certain promises to Isaac specifically, and Abraham is setting Isaac apart from his siblings, so that this promise can be fulfilled. So I guess maybe that's the purpose of this section.
I guess I want to agree with what you said about the primacy being on worshiping of Yahweh versus necessarily a particular ethnic group. I guess the only argument I'd have to that is, well, he went back to Ur of the Chaldeans, which, let's face it, wasn't a center of worship of Yahweh, to get Rebekah. So while I don't want to completely go, no, it's all about this and not about this. I guess I don't want to fall into a ditch on either side of that road.
Well,
sure, that's fair.
Wasn't Abraham supposed to direct his household and his children to serve the Lord and to do justice and to know? So, why wouldn't he have done that for this group? Did he just forget to do that with Keturah and her children? Or it seems like that was his responsibility for everybody in his household, and this now Keturah is taken into his household. So, what do you think went awry on this part? I mean, if was it just because he sent them away, or does that make sense? What I'm asking you?
Who are you asking that to?
I guess you had mentioned that it was about this religious thing, but I mean, Abraham was a worshiper of the Lord. His household was set apart to be this worshiping of the Lord. God said he was going to bring about his promise by Abraham instructing his household and his children. And so now we're seeing these descendants come along. He takes this other wife. I mean, wouldn't he have still been operating under that? He didn't tell Isaac to worship Yahweh, and then he just says, hey, all of these other kids, you guys do whatever you want, go worship these other false gods, and I'm sending you over there to worship. He wouldn't have done that, right? So
no,
that's not what you're saying.
No, but like I said, they're just. What my point was, they're not cursed by being sent away.
Hmm.
It's not a curse, and I think if you look back at what happened just shortly, this was just a few chapters ago, between Ishmael and Isaac, and there was a situation there that was tense, and then Ishmael was sent away. So I mean, maybe Abraham was trying to avoid something like that happening. I mean, realistically, you have a whole bunch of brothers together, and only one receives a particular promise. How are the other ones going to feel? I mean, I think maybe it was done for maybe practical reasons. Like, what are the odds of all these guys just accepting this and getting along? And I don't know. I think maybe it was done. Perhaps I'm thinking out loud here, but there may have been a practical.
Yeah, I guess the way I read the text, this is Abraham trying to ensure Isaac's primacy. He is the child of promise. He is the one who is the inheritor of Abraham's stuff. Now, do I think that sending Keturah and her family away and Hagar and Ishmael away is a quote unquote good thing? I'm sure it's problematic. I'm sure that sending your children off to live among pagans isn't the best thing for those children. It probably won't yield the same results, right? A modern day analogy is at Vodi Bakum, who said, we as Christians keep sending our kids off to Caesar to be educated in public schools, and we're surprised when we get Romans back. Probably in similar ways, like in his desire to not to ensure there's no opportunity for Isaac to lose his primacy. Did he do wrong? Was it not always a good thing for his other kids? I'm sure it was. I'm sure we can make the case for that.
Yeah, and I don't think God tells him. I don't think God ever told him to do that in the text.
If he did, it's not recorded.
Yeah, it's not recorded. Yeah.
And so I think your point is well taken about it not being a curse. I guess I was just adding something else. Like, it seems to me that the character that we've seen of Abraham is that he is a genuine worshiper of the Lord. He believed God so much that he was willing to obey, even up to the sacrificing of Isaac. Now we get that he has these other children. It doesn't seem to me that he was like just giving them over. We saw him part ways with Lot simply because they were so prosperous that they said the land can't sustain us. There's just, Abraham was a prosperous guy. Seems like he was a hard worker. Seems like the Lord was blessing them. And so maybe as he had all these extra sons, he said, I'm going to give you some gifts, but you got to go elsewhere because it's better for us to spread out. And I would think, based on everything that I've seen about him, maybe he would tell them two things. Hey, be faithful to the Lord. And if anybody asks about your wife, tell her she's your sister. Like those seem to be the things that he's really demonstrated in his character. And if it gets astray, kind of where I landed, and this is a more specific question, I'll just have you guys kind of evaluate where I landed when I was looking at this back in seminary. I thought this was being described to show us the fulfillment. God had said, I'm going to make of you a father of many nations. Mm-hmm. Well, he's told us about Isaac, and we're going to see that it's a very specific nation that comes from him. But this seemed to me to be the fulfillment of the rest of that. This is where the other many nations come from him.
No, I think that's sound. We get the nations from there. We get Esau becomes a nation. We get at least 12 tribes coming from Israel or from Ishmael. Excuse me. So I think if nothing else, then look, this promise or this portion of the promise, to some extent, if not even more in the future, has been and will be fulfilled.
I had that point in my original notes, and for some reason I didn't include them in the final copy. I don't know why I didn't, but yeah, I thought the same thing. And
I could say it and sound smart instead of you, maybe. I don't know.
For your sake, of course.
Thanks for that.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
No problem. But one other thing I want to say too is, he sent these people away. Does it say he sent Keturah away, or does it say that he? I don't know that he sent her away. I don't know if that's true or not. I know he certainly sent her sons away. Is that?
It says to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living and sent them away. So it seems like the sons, not necessarily the concubines.
Okay, so that was my assumption, was the sons were the ones sent away. Now, we talked about sending them, away, like almost. Some people might get the impression, well, he's separating them from his God. Well, there's no reason to think that. I mean, if he's sending them away, I'm sure they had a knowledge of the true God, and they got it from him. He probably taught them about the one true God. Now, of course, they had to live elsewhere for practical reasons and for, I mean, like the reasons I was saying earlier and what you said. So I don't see this as like cutting them off from his religion or something. I'm sure they took that with them, or they should have. And I'm sure he gave them the opportunity to take this with them into these other lands and perhaps spread this religion elsewhere. Whether they were faithful to do that or not, we're not told.
Well, and we see that with well, darn, I guess I can't go ahead. We will see, at least to some extent, that there is knowledge of Yahweh later in the text.
Yep. Oh yeah, for sure.
This has interesting implications for those who say, well, what about people who've never heard or cultures that have never been reached or something? There is at least some seeming biblical evidence that if this is all true, which of course we agree that it is, I understand some people just don't take this, as history or whatever. But if we're taking this as if it is actual history, yes, these other cultures that have rejected God, they did genuinely reject him. There was a knowledge of him, and they opted for something else. If they changed the stories, they did that. Like this is, and so their ignorance of the true and living God isn't because God selected, Abraham and kept it secret from everybody else, but it's because they actually over time suppressed the truth in their unrighteousness and went away from it. And now they've, exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped the created thing rather than the creator.
Someone's going from somewhere, getting himself a demerit.
Since I hand out demerits, I did not get one, but I was vague enough. No, but we had a similar conversation. I can't remember which one of you guys. I think maybe it was Eric, but Greg, forgive me if I'm attributing to him something that you said. But back in Noah's day, like we saw these lineages. Everybody could have known or should have known something about God, and they went away from it. And then we saw God's judgment, and then everything starts with Noah again. Again, every people group started with some basic knowledge of who God is. And so as cultures, shift away from that, the responsibility is on them. It's not like God kept them in the dark and didn't give them an awareness that there is a creator God. And so similarly, these nations, which we might meet again, and if they're not worshipers of the Lord, it just doesn't seem, Eric, I think your point is well made. It just doesn't seem like Abraham was saying, hey, I'm not going to teach these kids about Yahweh. I'm only teaching that to Isaac, and I'm sending them away so that they can be future enemies for him and not know anything about the God that I worship. That seems so far out of the character of everything that we've read about so far to me. So anyway, any other thoughts on that before we move on?
Well, and remember that in Genesis 12, remember that one of God's promises was that Abraham would be a blessing to all the nations.
Yes.
And so he wouldn't be a curse. He's not cursing these guys by sending them away. He would be a blessing to them. So we see that God's intention is to bless, not to curse.
Yeah. Amen. Greg, you got any last thoughts on this?
No, I'm all set.
All right. Well, in the next few verses 7 to 11, we read about Abraham's death. There's a very interesting phrase, and I'm curious what you guys think about it. He died at a ripe old age, the New American Standard says, and it says he was satisfied with years. It's been a while since I've done the word study, but that word satisfied is similar to our word satiated. So, when this video posts, Thanksgiving would have been last week. As we're filming it, we're all actually in the middle of Thanksgiving week, and that's a good analogy of when people kind of gorge themselves eating as much delicious food as they can. You eventually get to a point where all the goodness, you just say, that's it, I'm done. I can't eat one more bite. I'm satiated. I'm satisfied. That seems to be the description that Abraham, he's lived to the point where he's like, I've just had so much. I'm satisfied with my years. And then he dies. Any thoughts about this description about Abraham that stand out to you guys?
Yeah, I guess, the rampant gluttony and overeating that tends to happen at Thanksgiving is not what I would have equated this to. As because we write the questions before, and so as I had a chance to think about this question, something that just happened last week came to mind. We much to probably some people's chagrin, we've already decorated for Christmas. It's not Thanksgiving. Our house has been decorated for a couple of weeks. We decorated for my wife's birthday. And right now over my mantle are hanging 11 stockings, again, for my kids and my son-in-law now and my future son-in-law, and as Alyssa and I were sitting there one evening enjoying a fire, looking at the 11 stockings. While I'm not at the end of my life, at least I don't think so. I look and satisfied with the legacy that I'm building and have built and will continue to build. And so I would like to hope, I do hope that when I lay down and breathe my last, I can be surrounded by all the people that God has blessed me with, the legacy that I hopefully will have built, and I can be satisfied, not discontent, not filled with regrets. Not that we all don't manage to stack up plenty of regrets, but there's a way to look at what you're leaving behind and be satisfied, and a way to be discontent and discouraged. And so when I read this, I see an old man, a very old man, as a matter of fact, who's looking out at what God has done with his life and is satisfied. So I think it's a beautiful passage.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to that, but yeah, Abraham died at 175 years old, so he was...
That's an old man.
He was old. He had some good Social Security.
Ripe old age, yeah.
Yeah. He was apparently older, I guess, than most men of his day. At least that's what it makes it sound like. And he was satisfied with his long life and all the blessings that God had given him, just like Greg was saying. And the fact that Ishmael and Isaac came together to bury their father speaks to how respected Abraham was. I mean, his death was so significant that others put aside their differences to honor him. So it just speaks to the character of Abraham and the legacy that he left for future generations.
Well, I think you guys are making good points, and I do think this is intended to be a very beautiful passage. It's a description of a very beautiful, full life. Certainly, the modern images of gorging ourselves and maybe even regretting gorging ourselves shouldn't be incorporated into this. But contrasting that to, like, if you're invited to some pizza party or something, and there's 50 guys invited and they ordered 2 pizzas, and so everybody's looking around wondering if they could, there's that last slice and everybody's still hungry and they leave wanting more. That's not the description. And so some people, they get to the end of their life and they're trying to cling to life. There's like, I have things left to do, or I want more. That doesn't seem to be the description of Abraham. Abraham has lived a very full life. He is very satisfied. He's content, and almost to the point where you say he couldn't even live another day. He's been so blessed that another day wouldn't even be needed. And so he's done, and he wants to be buried with his wife. His sons come together and bury him. I think that is a beautiful thing. And so if you guys don't have anything else to add, I don't necessarily do as well.
This makes me think of the image from Bunyan, right? Pilgrim's Progress, where, and it's a very short scene, but again, it was impactful to me. I think it's Faithful who's the companion at the end, right? Yeah. Is that okay? So Christian and Faithful are both crossing the river Death at the same time, and Faithful, he's kind of like walking over this river as if it's a quarter inch deep. Meanwhile, over the same waters passing through Death, Christian is kind of drowning. It's my understanding that what Bunyan was doing is painting the portrait of some people approach death and they're terrified by it. And, they've, again, got these regrets and unsureties. And so it is a truly terrorizing event. And some people can just walk right over the waters of that river, joyously looking forward to what's next and not having those regrets. And so as I read this, I can't help but think of that picture that Bunyan painted.
Yeah, I think that's a good picture, and I appreciate you sharing it. So as we move on from Abraham's life, Isaac, we don't get a ton about him, but we are introduced in this same chapter to Isaac's descendants, and we get Jacob and Esau, and there's a pretty interesting prophecy about them even while they're still in the womb. What thoughts do you guys have about this prophecy that is declared about Jacob and Esau?
That question is so loaded with future implications. It's hard to answer without earning myself a demerit.
Well, it is a prophecy about the future, so it seems like you can talk about the future looking forward of it. You don't necessarily need to draw down on everything that you know about the future, but sure. What it's saying here, what should you expect for a potential future fulfillment of this? So long as it's not a false prophecy, right? I mean, if it's a true prophecy, what would you be expecting when you see something like this?
There is definitely some way in which the older will serve the younger. So again, God's we see here, I think, some providential choosing by the Lord over who is going to who the seed, who the story is going to continue through. Not the older, as would be expected, as would seem the normal path to the people, and instead through the younger.
Yeah, I think it just that God speaks of the future of two nations, and I think that's interesting because it's not, a prophecy about two individuals, but although God could very easily give that too, but it speaks of nations. The nation of the older child would serve in some way the nation of the younger child, and that would be fulfilled. And it was fulfilled, but I'm not going to say how. So there is a pattern in Scripture of God favoring the younger over the older. For example, God favored Isaac over Ishmael, and favored doesn't mean one was cursed and the other was blessed. Ishmael was actually blessed too, Ishmael and his descendants. But it just means that God had a special purpose in mind for Isaac's descendants that was unique, and the other nations that came from his other children, they just had different purposes, and so none of them were cursed. It's just if you have a special plan in mind, well, we're not there yet.
Part of what God promised is that He would bless those who blessed Abraham and his lineage, and He would curse those who cursed them. But choosing that lineage and maintaining that one, then it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else is cursed automatically. But should they curse that lineage, then they will be cursed. That's certainly true, and that's something that's been established by this framework already in the text that we've covered.
True. Yep. Yeah. So it's not an unconditional curse. I mean, if you do this, you'll be cursed. If you don't do that, well, presumably you won't be. And the intention, remember that the intention in Genesis 12 is to bless everybody, not to curse everybody except this one nation.
This lineage is specifically and explicitly chosen by God, that through this lineage, all the families of earth would be blessed. And if they would bless the offspring or the fruit of this lineage, they would be blessed. But if they would curse this lineage, then they would be cursed. That's at least the framework that God has established. It's interesting, this passage, again, should it come up again later, and there's other things, the choosing of one over the other to say, okay, the typical birth pattern is the older gets the blessing or the double portion or whatever else, the prestige or the preeminence, but I'm going to give it to the younger in this case. They already existed. This wasn't before they existed. Sometimes, people think, well, this is before they were born, right? But they are people. They're already struggling together in the womb. So these are human beings already. And we've talked about this, that our back in some of our systematic conversations, none of us think that life begins at birth. Of course, our life begins at conception. It is interesting that God's choosing of one over the other and electing one over the other, or preferring one over the other, or whatever language you want to use, does happen prior to birth, but after their existence. This is in contrast to a promise that God made about Isaac, which really was before he existed, right? And that's, God was making a promise that He was going to give a descendant to Abraham, and we've already documented it. But Abraham was like, well, how about Eliezer? Because I don't have an offspring. And then they had Ishmael through questionable decision making. He said, well, what about Ishmael? Because I've already got, and then now he gets this child of promise. But God was maintaining this promise literally before Isaac existed. He was not conceived yet, and he had chosen this lineage. Now this choice is being made while they exist, but are still in the womb. Do you have any thoughts about that at all? I at least wanted to kind of put that out there. These are some of the swirling thoughts in my mind, so I at least want to put them out on the record so that when we talk about these things conceivably later, which I imagine we will, we've at least had some initial outlining of the observations that we can make. But it is curious to see how God is making these choices and when He's making them. Do you guys have any other thoughts on that? Again, we don't have to belabor the point if you don't.
I guess what I'll say is there are times when we see what God does, for instance, we saw him choose Isaac. Isaac was an intention of God, had very specific plans for Isaac prior to Isaac's conception. Then later, we're looking at Isaac's sons, and we get something before they're born, but not before they're conceived. Now, does that mean, should we automatically rule out the fact, or the possibility, the potential, that God didn't have didn't have plans for them before they were conceived? No, we're told about it in time before they were born. Now, I don't want to go backwards or forwards either way. What I don't want to do is rule out the potential that God does sometimes work this way. So did God have the specific plan before they were conceived? It doesn't say that. So I don't want to force it to say that. But I don't want to say that it couldn't be. Does that make sense?
It does.
I don't want to force everything into one category or the other, but I don't want to rule out, because we've seen God do it here. Could he have done it here? Yes, but it doesn't say that. It doesn't mandate that we think that.
Yeah.
But it's possible.
Yeah. Now, I think that is a very important point, and part of the exercise of what we're trying to do is say, what does the text actually tell us? And I don't want to go beyond what is written. I think that you guys don't want to go beyond what is written. Sometimes we run well ahead of what is beyond what is written, because we can't separate ourselves from the systems that we already have. And so I want to make observations about what the text is actually telling us. And so I do see God choosing people and making declarations about their future before they're born. I also see God doing that before they're even conceived. Something I haven't seen yet is God saying, and it doesn't mean that he didn't do this. That's what I think your point is, Greg. So I'm agreeing with you, and I appreciate the way that you said it. Doesn't mean he didn't do this, but the text has never told us that God made these decisions before the world was made. He didn't say that I did these things before what I told you was recorded in Genesis 1. So since he's made the world, he has made these decisions. And sometimes it is to say, I'm going to give you a child, and then I'm going to do this through that child. Other times it's, okay, you have 2 children in your womb, and this is what I'm going to do in the future. But he hasn't gone. So I just want to see, what has God actually done? What has he actually said? And people can theorize about what also potentially God could do. Sure. But the text hasn't said anything beyond those things. And so I'm just trying to put it again, establish what has the text actually told us so far. And so I appreciate your observations as well. Eric, you got anything else to add on this?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure what the original question was. It seems like it kind of took, took a turn, but I think you were talking about like the fact that God, said he was going to do something for, an unborn child. The implication is there's a child in there. I think did I completely miss your point?
No, I mean, that's part of the point.
Okay.
We've seen, there was a recent commenter interacting with you about a statement that you made back in one of our previous, episodes, just about how God, knows what he knows and how he interacts with time. And of course, there are things that people will assume. I think you said it maybe in our last episode, although you can correct me if I'm misremembering, but that sometimes people say things about God in the future, and you said, well, prove it. Like, don't just state it or assert it because your system says, like, show me a verse that says these things, and then I'll believe it. But if you can't show me a verse, stop just assuming it and going beyond the text because, God has to or must or whatever. Well, the Bible's telling us about God. I don't want you to tell me about God. I want the Bible to tell me about God. And so don't tell me what your logical principles or your philosophical principles require me to believe about God. God has told me what I want to believe about him. And so I'm just trying to say, well, as we're looking at God choosing people and picking people and fulfilling the promises that he's said, I'm going to give you this child, and then this is what I'm going to do with them. That was before that child existed. He said, now, there are 2 children in your womb. This is what I'm going to do with these children. I'm going to pick this one, and this nation will be greater than the other one. This nation will serve the other one. God's saying what he's going to do. But all of that has been in time so far. None of it was ever, I made this plan before I spoke light into existence and before I filled the sea with fish and the air with birds. He's never said that, at least not to this point. We can keep our eyes open. Maybe he'll say that sometime, but he hasn't said it yet. So I'm just trying to document what he has actually said, and all of it seems like, he's doing this in time.
And
For
what
those
I
who
want to
think
do,
God exists outside of time, they say, well, God is doing all this, but it's only from your perspective. I say, okay, fine. Then I would say the same thing Eric said. Well, prove it. Show me some verse that says that. Sorry,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Greg.
no, I mean, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter and the glory of kings to uncover it. I appreciate the attempt to explain the things that aren't readily explained. Like I think it is human nature to want to make sense of what we see going on around us, what we see going on in the text. And so while I don't want to discourage that, I also just don't want it to become so calcified in our minds that we have to divide over it. We can't, I conceptualize this idea and I manage to pluck out enough proof text to maybe make it hold together a little bit. And then I say, if you don't agree with me, there's something wrong with you. You're deficient. And I'm not even sure that you're a Christian. Well, guess what? You've gone beyond the text. And so yay to trying to uncover these things. But just, I think we just need to be super careful. And I mean, and history proves that we aren't, right? Christians are not careful about not taking it too far. We've proved if we're going to do anything, we're going to take it too far and find some reason to divide over it. So,
Amen.
Okay, well, I think that's probably good for that point. Huh.
All right.
What's a smirk,
on.
Joe? There's a smirk.
No, I'm in agreement. I was waiting for Eric, and then he just said, "Let's move on." So, all right. Well, let's move on. So we get this prophecy, which we just talked about, and then the text very quickly kind of zooms through seemingly their childhood, and then we get this interesting passage about Esau selling his birthright, which at least is beginning to probably show us the fulfillment of this passage. We don't need to zoom so far ahead into the future. We're getting some, at least initial fulfillments of this right away. I know that this passage strikes a lot of people as very strange. It seems like one of the craziest or most foolish or most impulsive decisions, really, to sell your birthright for some stew. My son, I know when he was reading this, he would always laugh when he'd get to this, get to this passage. It always cracked him up for some reason.
Sure. I don't know. Maybe I'm just trying to. I mean, I want to take nothing away from Esau's poor decision, where God's word says that he despised his birthright. He considered it of little account. But I'm also willing to look at Jacob and go, man, you're kind of shady, dude. I'm not convinced that you are the most upright of guys. So again, we see the text not trying to paint, in my opinion, not trying to paint people in a better light than they truly are.
As I read through this, Jacob is again very unlikable. I like Esau way more, and it's a strange thing to be in
because he's a hunter and Isaac's just hanging out in tents like women. Let's get out and do some man stuff instead.
I'm not touching that one. Eric, what do you say about this passage?
Well, as I read this, it really sounds like Jacob took advantage of Esau's hunger and convinced him to sell his birthright. We know that happened, but it comes across as if Jacob had been looking for an opportunity to do this for some time. It wasn't like he just thought, maybe I just should see if he'll give me his birthright here. It seems like this was plotted. This was something that Jacob had been looking forward to, and he saw the opportunity and he seized it, and that's how he got the birthright. I would think it was through a plot. Now, Esau was certainly not blameless, though. I mean, come on. He allowed his hunger to drive him to make this foolish decision, and one that he very much regretted. As Greg pointed out, he despised his birthright after this. So Jacob is a very shady guy, and I don't know if maybe this is saying too much. We know, I don't see any reason to believe from the text that he was really a follower of Yahweh yet. I think we'll see as time goes on. At least I hope we'll see that Jacob changes his ways. But he's not portrayed as a good person in this chapter.
I certainly agree with that. And so we have some interesting dynamics that are going on here. And theoretically, should this passage come up again, which we all know that it will. It's good for us to really understand it in its original context. I read it just like you guys. This is not painting Jacob in like some heroic light. This, Greg, I'll use your terminology again. This is what happened. Doesn't mean that this is what ought to have happened. This isn't trying to tell us that deceiving people or lying in wait to try and catch them and take advantage of them when they're at their, most susceptible or most vulnerable is a good thing to do. In fact, I suspect we'll see some teachings telling us that this is all bad conduct. Like, this isn't stuff that we should be trying to emulate. However, we did see this prophecy immediately before, God saying that the older will serve the younger. And in that culture, that is not something that would normally happen. And so we see a description of in the narrative of the details that kind of brings about that turn, that the table is turned, that now the older sells his birthright to the younger. This is the scenario for it, as seemingly almost contrived as it might be, and almost shockingly unbelievable. Like, who would give up their birthright for, he must have been in some very either desperate situation or he was just a complete fool. However, I'm interested in your thoughts on how God's sovereign declaration about the future and how, there's nothing in this passage that's saying that God is like forcing this to happen or that he's coercing their actions. It does seem like these are just the natural actions that they take. Do you have any thoughts just about this? Because this is one of those great mysteries, and we are speculating a little bit, but as this text is presenting this, there's a prophecy and then a fulfillment. God's declared something, but then it seems like these human agents are acting as they would normally act. Do you have any other thoughts about this? And again, I'm not trying to get us to solve the whole sovereignty, human freedom, or human agency discussion, but just any observations that you could have about that, because it's a very interesting passage in that, because they occur so closely together within the text.
Yeah, I think they occur for a reason, right? So as I read this, I think of us as one of those, you meant it for evil, but God was going to do something good out of it, right? In my personal theology, I have no doubt that when God foretold that the older would serve the younger, that he knew Jacob and Esau, and he foresaw these events. And while Jacob is a schemer, and a bit of a schemer at least, and Esau is a bit of a fool at least, these were the means by which these things were going to come about. That's the way I read the text.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Again, we don't really know always how God brings his plans about. He doesn't always say. Sometimes he does. Sometimes we are told. Most of the time, we're not. And I think sometimes, and I'm speculating here, but sometimes there's a combination of foreknowledge and actually, actively bringing certain things about. So I think that God can use both. There are things that God. We know God foreknows things, but how exactly he foreknows and then, is able to change the situation to fulfill his plans. It's really, the saying, God works in mysterious ways is really, it's pretty accurate. We don't really know how God brings about these plans unless we're told, and we're not told very often how exactly he does it and what his technique was to bring it about. We're just kind of left in the dark, and in some cases. But I just find it amazing that God is mysterious. God can bring these things about however he does, and we just stand in awe.
Well, amen to that. It is interesting. Esau genuinely had the birthright of the older, and he genuinely sold it. And this is the fulfillment, at least in part, of how the scenario could change, that the older would begin to serve the younger. And it is curious to see that, there are passages, maybe that we've already encountered, but certainly that we'll see later, of God being much more involved in bringing that about. And this just seems to be stated. It was said, and then it happened. And it doesn't seem like God was, necessarily, at least explicitly, manipulating things behind the scene. And so people will come up with different explanations of how that can be. But the fact that it is at least interesting for us to state, and it is, it's just stated very closely here. So I appreciate your thoughts. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next chapter that you guys have before we close down our conversation on Genesis 25?
No.
Nope.
All right. Well, in Genesis 26, Isaac moves, and we start to see him. It's kind of that saying, the like father, like son. We see him repeating some of the same patterns that we saw in Abraham. You guys have any thoughts on Isaac's, the description of him relocating and some of the conduct that he has in chapter 26?
Nothing too specific. It's just, I think here we see, just humanity tending to walk after the examples that we've had. I doubt, at least it's not my suspicion, that Abraham's sat Isaac down and said, "Hey, listen, here's what you're going to do. You're going to set for." But there must have been something about the way Abraham ordered some of his affairs, or I say it appears to me that there would have been something about Abraham and how he ordered affairs that aren't recorded for us that led Isaac to at least have this idea. It seems too specific. It seems too similar to just be a coincidence to me.
Yeah, there's a lot here in Genesis 26 and about Isaac, relocating and all the stuff that happens with claiming Rebekah as his sister and the prosperity and all that, all the other things. And I guess in the question, I think, was originally like, we see that there's this, there's like this, like God's directing these things, right? But yet, there's human participation in things. And one of the things I guess that I was thinking about with this is, God blessed Abraham, and Abraham was certainly not a perfect man. We've already discussed that. He had his shortcomings and those kinds of things. As I was reading this, I found it interesting that it says that I'm gonna get okay. Perfect. I turned right to the chapter.
Providence of God, brother.
It has to be. It has to be. It says in verse 1, now there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. It's so funny how you see like this almost repeat of history, and all these things happen, and they happen so similarly. It's like, he said like father, like son. It really was a lot like that. But one of the reasons God blessed Isaac was because of the faithfulness of his father Abraham. It wasn't because Isaac did everything correctly. For example, it says in verse 5, and this is talking about God is speaking to Isaac, and he says, "I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So it's like God was blessing Isaac and his family because of the faithfulness of Abraham. It says also in verse 24, the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." So it's like Abraham's faithfulness and obedience carried over to the next generation. Now, I will say Isaac did obey also. Now, not perfectly, of course, because no one can, but God told him in verses, was it 2 and 3? He says, "Don't go down to Egypt. There's a famine. Things are dire, but don't go down to Egypt." And he didn't. So he did obey somewhat. But so I think it was a combination of God honoring Abraham's faithfulness and blessing Isaac as a result. But also Isaac was still obedient too, even though his obedience looked a little bit different, and his disobedience looked very similar to Abraham's also. So I just think it's kind of funny how things turned out.
Zooming out from this micro view of things, I also want to say that I think we should still be looking for that promised seed, right? That serpent crusher who is to come. And I think one thing this text does is it says, like, he's still coming. This isn't him. Keep looking. The promise hasn't failed. God's still working, but Isaac isn't the one. So keep watching, keep looking. Because if he was the one, he wouldn't be engaged in the same foolish sinfulness that his father did. So keep looking for that serpent crusher.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The even just the strangeness of the language, the seed of the woman. It's a very unique phrase. Now we just keep seeing this, the seed of each person, the seed of Abraham, of Isaac, and we'll probably continue to see that. And none of these are, even if they might be hoped that maybe this will be the fulfillment, yet all of them clearly, once we start to see them, these are not the ones. And so there is this expectation that is still looming and building, and so that's very well said. The last kind of issue, this chapter, Eric, you touched on a lot of the major themes in here. This chapter just ends with a couple of verses about Esau marrying some women and causing some grief. What do you guys think about this as this chapter comes to an end, this grief that's caused?
Yeah, for me, the way I read it is, we should take note that these are Hittite women. These are the daughters of the sons of Heth. Heth was the son of Canaan. So here we have this people that are meant to be, Abraham's lineage are meant to be separate, meant to be apart, and yet here is a son of Abraham marrying daughters of a cursed people, the Canaanites. And so, goodness, why wouldn't we expect problems? This should be an alarm bell going off in the text for us. Like this is not headed in a good direction.
Yeah. Remember what Abraham said in Genesis 24:3. Don't take a wife from the Canaanites. And of course, Esau marries not one, but two Hittite women. And so that was probably a cause of grief. And I would assume that they were not worshipers of Yahweh. And perhaps, they may have caused Isaac and Rebekah problems. Maybe we're not told that. I'm speculating, but they may have been quarrelsome people. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if daughter-in-laws weren't getting along. So it's one of those things that I think all of that. I try and look at take all that into consideration.
Certainly when we see God giving instructions or through this lineage and deviations from that, the kind of open-ended causing grief, we could speculate about what that would be, but this isn't the ideal thing. As I said, I read this and I kind of have some compassion for Esau, but I do also recognize he makes a lot of decisions that are not great. And so he is just very quickly here being described as saying, oh yeah, and he did this other thing, which also was not great. And so, it's so curious to me as we read through these things that we see God's faithfulness, and you guys have said it, I'm just reaffirming that I see it too. We read this and go, man, these people make a lot of questionable decisions, and yet God is still at work. And I'm comforted by that. Because as I said before, I'll say again, if my life was recorded in Scripture, you'd go, man, this guy makes some questionable decisions. And yet God is still at work. And so I hope that people are encouraged by that. You guys got any other final thoughts on Genesis 24, 25, or 26 before we conclude our discussion for today?
No, I think I'm good.
About an hour's worth, yeah.
About an hour's worth. Well, lay it on us. You better. We're going to get you talking like the Micro Machines man, real fast. All right.
We'll just speed up the tape, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, God has plans He's going to fulfill. And I know that whatever God promises, this is a simple point. It kind of goes back to Abraham. And I was thinking about Abraham's sacrifice or being willing to sacrifice Isaac. God is willing to fulfill His plans. He's willing and able to fulfill all of His plans, even when it seems impossible. And we just have to trust Him to do it and not doubt. So I'd see this, this theme coming up again and again and again. And I would just leave it at that.
Yeah, well, that's a good place for us to conclude our discussion for today. And so that is our conversation on Genesis 24, 25, and 26 in our Biblical Theology Project. If you're enjoying these conversations, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any of our future episodes. If you know of other people who you think might enjoy studying along the scriptures together with us, go ahead and share the video with them. As always, you've heard what we've said, so put your comments below if you think that we missed something that we should have talked about, or if you have something to contribute to the conversation. We'd love to read your thoughts down in the comments section below. And until we see you again for our next conversation, in a few chapters in Genesis, we hope that you'll get equipped, that you will obey your King, and that you will live to glorify your God.
Okay, well, I think that's probably good for that point.